Today, I shall address one, or maybe the most tragic aspect of that early 21st century, which is the best proof that we are already in a fall and decline, or decline and fall of the capitalist system. The true proof that it is absurd to speak of depression. But we are in at a time of a collapse of an economic and social structure which was capitalism. And here is the problem of austerity. So, in first part, I shall try to explain what is austerity, a term which never appeared in the economic and political literature before the mid-70s of the 20th century. Nobody before ever spoke of austerity. Austerity being a concept borrowed to the conservative Catholic theology, as I told you, of Saint Augustine and the Counter-Reformation. In a second part, I shall try to address the question, why are governments, or what remains of governments, addicted to austerity? It has nothing to do with neoliberalism. In the last part, I shall explain that the worst aspect of this austerity inquisition is the Eurozone. It is why, since the start, I supported the rejection, the absolute rejection of the European Monetary Union. Yesterday, I understood that in some of the books which were presented, some authors spoke of the sovereign debt, a bizarre notion. Before this early 21st century, nobody spoke of the sovereign debt, but they spoke of the public debt. And the paradox is that sovereign debt are issued by states which surrendered any sovereignty. So, first, and indeed, in conclusion, what should be done to get rid of austerity? My answer will be straightforward. It needs a cultural revolution, a true, and to get rid, I am cautious, at least for Europe, of the whole political elite. But first, what is austerity? Austerity has nothing to do with old cyclical, short-run policies of deflation which aimed at restoring full employment and price stability out of a drop in real wages by a decrease in public expenditures. But they were short-run policies and they aimed at restoring full employment. Indeed, the reasoning was absurd, and the proof had been brought about by Keynes himself in the general theory in the chapter on wages. Students were taught, I don't know if they are still taught, of the very existence of Keynes, that Keynes postulated the rigidity of wages. The truth is that Keynes was perfectly aware that unemployment would generate a drop in wages. But if wages start to fall, the outcome will be a spiraling process of deflation, generating a total collapse of the system. Thereby, the stability of money wages is a policy objective and not a postulate. But what is now austerity is completely different. First, austerity are not short-run policies, but very long-run or permanent policies. Second, they are not targeting the restoration of full employment out of a short-run decrease in public expenditures. To the contrary, full employment has been completely rejected as a policy target. State policies must target a permanent and long-run increase of true full employment, which means both a permanent decrease in the quantity of labor hired by the private sector or the state, but also a decrease of both money wages and the purchasing power of wages, real wages. Old deflation policies thereby had in mind some long-run increase in growth, while now permanent austerity means no more real growth. Growth, whatever the definition, is the arch enemy of stability. But stability of what? Stability of just the financial superstructure of capitalism to maintain the highest possible increase in banks' net wealth or other financial institutions. the real sector, the infrastructure, is completely outside the horizon of austerity policy makers. And this is new. Even people like Pigou and Housray in the interwar period had in mind the real sector. Now, no, it is finished. It means that as long as we try to formalize, which I did in a recent paper relative to the Eurozone, we entered some kind of uncharted territory like Star Trek. First, the laws of the monetary circuit are completely violated. Taking care of the fact that banks and non-banking corporations are interlocked, the more we permanently deflate the real economy, the more there should be price stability, which is a relationship accepted in the book by Rogov and Carmen Reinhardt, and which is completely contradicted by historical data. Why? Because holders of financial assets are interested into the purchasing power of their assets. Second, permanent deflation of the real economy, permanent increase in unemployment will automatically generate an increase in the share of profits for obvious reasons. For instance, in Europe, people in power, including the arch supporter of austerity, Michel Aglietta, the most conservative and right-wing economist, is dreaming on some kind of super China's model. Out of the collapse of employment, wages could fall in real terms below the Chinese level. And thereby, there will be, in some future, an enormous inflow of capital, deemed the economics of Marie Antoinette in the late days of the French monarchy. The economy was collapsing, but Marie Antoinette and the king had still sumptuous parties. They don't have bread, give them brioche or tortillas, if I dare say. But why do holders of assets want such a rise in the rate, in the share of profit? Because, and this could be checked, the more there is a rise in the share of profit, the more the value of equipment held by firms, even though it is not used, is rising. It is a total rejection of any kind of value theory. And claims of banks on firms will also rise. I told once to Michel Aglietta, but if people knew that, the austerity dogma is justifying the most critique of the bourgeoisie by the most right-wing extremists, left-wing extremists, when they still existed. The third, austerity has an obvious impact, or at least for its promoters, on the exchange rate. Why? Because usually the relative value, if using some kind of a post-Fixerian theory of exchange rate, we could define the real or natural exchange rate as the ratio between the real value of a currency, the euro, relative to the real value of the dollar. And by simplifying, the natural rate of exchange of the euro relative to the dollar or the yen should reflect the ratio of long-run expected rate of unemployment. If the natural rate was ruling, we would reach the conclusion that since the effective rate of unemployment in Europe, in the Eurozone, is 4 or 5 times its level in the US, Japan, the euro is obviously grossly overvalued. I made a quick exercise, the euro should fall by at least 40 or 50%, because there will be no more European real economy. But as in Wechsel, in his theory of interest rate, there is also the speculative exchange rate, which is determined not by real forces, but by pure speculation. And it is exactly what is happening now. The promoters of austerity rely on a model in which there is an inverse relationship between the effective rate of growth and the market or speculative exchange rate, which means that we should promote negative exchange rates to get an increase. No, sorry, growth, a negative rate of growth to promote a rise in the exchange rate of the currency. Why? Because since the postulate is that the real economy no more matters, the more real economy is deflated, the more there will be an increase in the demand for financial assets and an inflow of capital. Why do they want a strong euro if we were still in textbook economics? It should be absurd to where Europe could export. And even the Germans are now suffering from a drop of their exports. But what they have in mind is that thanks to the rise in the euro relative to the dollar, they could buy an increasing stock of assets denominated in other currencies, and thereby, for the most rabid advocates, took control of the American economy. This policy, how is it implemented? As I told briefly, monetary policy has a very small impact because there is a strong inflation in Europe which is completely outside the control of the European central banks. And what explains that outrageous inflation between 7 or 8 and 9% in France and Germany? It is the enormous increase in rents, 17 square meters apartment in Paris, the rent is 800 euros a month. So, enormous inflation in terms of housing, the social security is collapsing, the educational system is in such a state of decay that families strive to send their children to private institutions, extremely expensive, etc. And meanwhile, the big difference on which Rogoff and Reinhardt are completely unaware is that in the first structural crisis of the late 20s and early 90s, there had been a strong drop in prices. Now, there is not the least drop in prices, even for food and basic consumption. To the contrary. So, wages are falling, prices are rigid or rising. And this is the new world, which means a total collapse of the purchasing power. So, how is austerity implemented? By fiscal policy, which means a permanent, targeted decrease in all kinds of state expenditures, even the most productive, with at the same time increase in taxes, so as to get a balance or a surplus budget. The impact is obviously strongly negative, with a private system which for a long time is more and more reluctant to spend. Net private investment, net I say, in France and Germany in the Eurozone is now quasi zero. Where the Germans or the French invest, they invest in what is the new colonial empire of France and Germany, Eastern Europe. This was the raison d'être, the core of the creation of the euro. The state being deprived of any control of its currency. It is as though a foreign currency became the currency. The Eurozone is in some way the same situation like Argentina at the time of the currency board. But there is worse. All the European treaties had in mind budget balance or surplus, whatever could be the real situation of the economy. Why? Because of what was the ruling ideology or political philosophy of the European Monetary Union. Those who created the system were more or less followers of the arch adversary of Keynes, the most reactionary economist who ever existed, Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek's core idea was that to go out of the road to serfdom, title of his book, 1944, we must abolish the modern state, which means the Republican elected state. To quote Hayek, and the others promoters of the system, including Michel Adlieta, the modern state is the enemy of the market laws, which means no more social security, no more free education, no more state research, no more compensation of unemployment, no more long-run research promoted by the state. We don't need that, said Hayek in his book, The Constitution of Liberty, 1960. Thereby, what happened? Being deprived of an independent possibility of creating money, the state was henceforth dealt with as if he were a private corporation. Nobody understands austerity policies if we don't have in mind that their first commandment he must be dealt with not only as a private corporation having to beg money to private banks as private corporations, but more for Hayek and supporters of austerity, the state is not a productive corporation. It is wasting real resources. It can never create real wealth. Again, I could rely, you could tell me it's an obsession, but since there are so much mistakes about him, Aglietta is absolutely explicit on this question. Thereby, what was hoped by austerity promoters was that banks, being rational, they will reject any demand from the state of loans, and thereby the state will be obliged to squeeze itself. And this had been beautifully expressed in the bulletin of the European Central Bank in 2005 or 6, if I remember well. Banks being rational, financial markets being rational, the state will be completely paralyzed. But it didn't happen as expected, because central bankers, technocrats, whatever they are, especially in Europe, are not economists. They are politicians without any true training in economics. Whatever could be said of Bernanke, at least he has some understanding of economics. So, what happened? At the same time, the European private sector corporations decided that it was too risky and dangerous to borrow banks for investment. Too much uncertainty for the future. Better to acquire financial assets. The demand for loans by household had a limit, because European households are obviously more than bankrupt. And contrary to what is believed by some, households do not borrow for luxury consumption. They borrow for basic consumption, for rents, for their children, medical cares, and their likes. So maybe it is true in Mexico, but to pretend that households borrow to import luxury consumption, to play the life of jet setters is completely untrue for Europe. Thereby, banks were in a situation. Banks need borrowers. If there are not borrowers, what could banks do? So, the states, because of austerity, were obliged to run increasing bad deficits, which is undergraduate accounting. So, because of the lack around 2005 or 2006 of other borrowers, banks were very happy to acquire debt issued by the state. Even Greece, there was an enormous jump of all bankers over the debt issued by Greece, Spain, Portugal, France, and Germany. The problem, and the state had to pay enormous rates of interest. The Greeks had to pay to French and German banks between 18 or 20% interest rates, more than a lot of African countries. The same for Spain, Portugal, the same for France. But now happens the 2008 crisis in Wall Street, which, by the way, is much more complex than many people believe. It has nothing to do with the so-called bad loans. Why banks finance bad loans for a law, especially the blacks in Texas? I was in Texas at that time, to acquire houses at the very request of the federal government. And indeed, the result was that banks played the role of the state And for the first time, ghettos outside Austin and Dallas, excuse me, because I was there, were suppressed. And there was a tremendous increase in security. Too many people forget that. And the then chair of the federal board perfectly knew the situation. But the subprime had nothing to do, I think, with the collapse of Wall Street. The collapse of Wall Street was that not banks, but financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and the likes had been borrowing zillions to banks to finance a cumulative speculation, which was obviously a bet on the future. But speculation cannot survive forever. There happened a time when expectations change. So, at a sudden, there was, like in the late 20s, a collapse of the most tricky financial assets, which had nothing to do with any kind of productive investment. Banks indeed had created more and more money for Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers. How could you think that Goldman Sachs could survive without a creation of money by banks? So banks started to suffer from losses. But there was more. And here enters a little known phenomenon. European banks. European banks had not the least confidence into the euro. They perfectly knew that the European economy was in a process of collapse. So what did the French and German banks did? Well, they had borrowed hundreds of millions, maybe 10 or 20 or 40 billions of dollars to American banks. And what did they do with those dollars? Partly, they recycled their dollars into Eastern Europe, but mainly they invested into the US. And and into the most trickiest financial assets. So, when American banks started to suffer from losses, like Margaret Thatcher, they said to the French and German, we want our money back. The problem is that European banks didn't have reserves in dollars. They turned to the European Central Bank for reasons, I must say, a bit difficult to understand, but it was a tradition. The European Central Bank, or rather the oligarchy of independent central bank, because in Frankfurt there is no federal reserve system. The European Central Bank as such has no balance sheet. The power is in the hands of the so-called Council of Governors, which means the Banque de France and the Bundesbank. So they didn't have reserves in dollars, but they had gold. American banks were completely uninterested by gold. They wanted dollars. So the European system could have collapsed, and banks really could have been bankrupt. Not because of the state debt. The state public debt were maybe between 5 or 8% of assets. So, for reasons I don't have a logical explanation. I think it was a mix of policy and corruption. The Bush administration and the then Secretary of Finance, Paulson, and the policy and Bernanke, and after the same policy was maintained by the Obama, the Federal Reserve System decided to lend dollars to the European Central Bank by day per day contract, the so-called swaps. Each day the contract has to be renewed. So the dollars went back to banks, and after they went back to American banks. It was a violation of the US Constitution, but so the euro and austerity policy, which were implemented to make euro the new gold, was saved by the Americans, the Federal Reserve System. So, more than ever, the euro was completely enslaved to the goodwill of the American government. It is true that some turned to other sources. There were indeed some inflow of capital from Qatar, not from Saudi Arabia, from Gaddafi in Libya. There were secret agreements between, especially during the reign of Nicolas Sarkozy, between the French government and Muammar Gaddafi. It is why everybody should know that Gaddafi was executed by French paratroopers. Imagine the scandal. But the Chinese were obvious. We don't want to be involved into a dying area and system. We will never lend you dollars. We are not interested into Europe, but only into the American market. Since the Europeans can no more import from us, let them die. And it is true, you see. The share of import from China is quite zero in the European balance sheet. So the situation became more and more fragile. The European leaders were afraid that the speculation could turn against the euro when, with such an increase in unemployment, negative growth, poverty, and their likes. I had a discussion last night about poverty. I do think that an increasing share of the population in Europe is reaching the poverty level as it is defined by the United Nations. Inequality never has reached such a level. Social promotion is completely dead. So, what did the Europeans do? They never changed their policy, they reinforced. First, there had been the Growth and Stability Pact, a wonderful term, with, as I told you, that little paragraph exempting expenditure required by the security of the state from austerity. It explains why France has 300,000 people, soldiers, in Africa. They passed a new treaty, which is beautiful. The dream of Friedrich Hayek made true. The so-called fiscal consolidation pact. It imposes that first, the state, all states, are obliged to maintain the European norms, deficit never greater than 3% of the GDP. I abstract because it would require a special conference, the subtleties, worth of the Vatican, of the differences between structural deficits and non-structural deficits. Let us abstract from that. But, yeah, just some words. But the real economy continued to collapse. Political pressure increased from grassroots people. So the fiscal consolidation pact is imposing the transfer of fiscal policy to an independent commission of high officials, technocrats appointed for 8 years, paid 20,000 euros a month and tax-free because of the subtleties of the French administrative law. And they decide the budget. The parliament is completely henceforth outside fiscal policy. Thereby, what remains of the state? Nothing but the power of distillating fear in the people. And the French president decided that it could be done without any change in the constitution, while it is obviously an absolute violation of the constitution. It never exists anywhere else in the world. So recently, because of the collapse of the economy, the deficit had reached 3.7%, horror. The newly appointed commission vetoed the budget and imposed new taxation and new cuts in expenditures. And who drafted those ultra policies? The very Michel Aglietta, who started as a Marxist a very long time ago. The problem is that austerity is now permanent. There has been, as I told you some days ago, after the outcome of Italian elections, an emergency meeting in Frankfurt with all the with President of France, Angela Merkel, central bankers and their like. And they said, we will never change our policy, whatever happens. We are right and the people are wrong. So, and the same has been said by David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, with zero growth. He said 2 days ago, yes, the economy is collapsing, I will never change. So it's obvious that the situation is unbearable. It could lead to a total chaos in Europe, in the world economy. Thereby, we should indeed get rid of austerity. For Europe, it means rejecting the euro. the euro cannot be amended no more than the church. To think of a new young pope Hollywood liked is absurd. Like to think of a Keynesian and pro-people euro. But it will need indeed that people truly understand why they are suffering, which means debates, which means some kind of cultural revolution, which means that the ruling elite should be sent to monasteries or maybe to the church. What should be economic and social policy rooted into, not into quasi mystical ideology, but in objective truth and science. First, no country should surrender its sovereignty on the currency. Principle one. Because a state without the control of its currency, without absolute control of the central bank, is not a state at all. And European states are now backed to what was France at the end of the ancient regime. So the euro should be finished as it is. No more independent European Commission, no more independent central bank, no more exogenous limits on the deficit. Bon. Second point, as I proved, no economy can promote long-run true growth if there is not an anchor, a leading factor, which is state net expenditures or investment. Able to finance its expenditures without any constraint from the banking system. It means that the economy doesn't need any kind of the so-called capital imports to finance its reconstruction or development. That very notion of capital imports is, by the way, an hoax coming from the imagination of technocrats from the IMF. No country imports real capital. It imports foreign currency created by foreign banks. Which means that capital imports are finally a source of dependence and enslavement of the economy. As far as I know, none of the so-called great power before ever were financing their growth or development out of inflow from foreign currency. It means that being free from any artificial and arbitrary control, the state must target very long-run growth of its net expenditures and the very term deficit should be suppressed. It is not a scientific concept, it is an ideological concept. As wrote a long time ago the great American economist Robert Eisner, all corporations were and are in deficit if we apply the orthodox definition. I am not aware that Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Edison ever finance their research and creation of industry out of their ongoing profits. But it should be a lesson. It means that I go back to this point, the book by Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt should be burned near the Cathedral of Mexico. It is an accumulation of errors, mistakes. So the state should commit in the very long run of a permanent increase in net investment, direct net investment, both for the reconstruction of the stock of capital, for the reconstruction of human capital, and to allow true full employment. The notion of structural unemployment lacks any foundation, and rise in welfare. Maybe it would require, but that would need some collective research, new concepts. Our empirical or theoretical concepts are from a system of another era. As soon as you raise the leading role of consumption, conservative, right-wing, aging technocrats say, but you are favoring the youth who are spendthrift, wishing luxury consumption. It is shocking. It proves their total contempt of the people and the fact that they confuse the youth people with MTV teenagers living in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles. So I prefer the term welfare, which means increasing in the majority of people expenditures, abolishing rationing, abolishing constraints, allowing a rise in culture, standard of living, and their likes. Full employment is only a part of such a policy. We could demonstrate that there are no system without an exogenous leading factor, which means some agent not constrained and leading all other participants to the economic process. But of course, money created by the state is endogenous, since it is financing expenditures. A stateless economy and Hayekian economy never existed before, but in decadent and archaic economies. What about exports? None of the existing most developed countries, while they are undeveloping, ever played all on exports. For a simple reason, that net export surplus need that there are countries accepting net export deficit, something which seems forgotten now. The domestic economy must be, in the long run, the core source of growth and increasing wealth for society as a whole. Does this proposition implies protectionism or devastating exchange rates? I would say no. First, protectionism in history has always been used to decrease the standard of living, the purchasing power of workers in the largest sense. When Napoleon III in 1861 passed the Treaty of Free Trade with the British, who supported Napoleon III? The socialist and Karl Marx. Because Karl Marx, who was a very keen observer of reality, remarked that the right wing of the French bourgeoisie maintain prohibitions to impose outrageous low wages and outrageous high prices. As for exchange rates, as I told you, we need a theory of exchange rates. I tried very quickly to explain it. But personally, like Mario Secaricia, I am supporting flexible or floating exchange rates. Fixed exchange rates were always a disaster. The source of speculation and arbitrary fixed exchange rate. It is why I was against the Bretton Woods system. If the foreigners who run a trade surplus relative to the country do not want the domestic currency, they will pay the price by depreciation of their assets. And are exchange rates a leading factor in international trade? The question is not obvious. I think that we are overemphasizing the impact of exchange rates. For instance, why did Germany enjoy for a long time a trade surplus? Because the Germans, even since the days of Bismarck, invested a lot of scientific research in their industry. All the highest managers in the chemical industry, in the steel industry, were well-known scientists and Nobel Prize, which the British never did. One of the reasons of the decline of Britain, which started in the 80s of the 19th century, was the absolute contempt of the British ruling elite for scientific research. You could read what Keynes wrote about the content of teaching in the prestigious private school. Science, mathematics were very second-rate, while they spoke Latin very fluently. And that integration of advanced research attained its apex during the last years of the Nazi era, when Albert Speer, the Minister for Armament and Research, invested an enormous amount of money endowing German firms with such an advanced technology that it couldn't be used efficiently at that time. And the Americans were absolutely stunned by the advance of available technology in the German industry and in many other fields. So, the problem is that now in Europe and in the US, there is an increasing contempt for very high level research, some obsession for short-term research directly generating profits. It is the business schools culture, which are one of the main causes of the decline of the West. And this has been written in a book I recommend by a German philosopher, historian, Oswald Spengler, in his book, The Decline of the West, published in 1932 and 1933, in which Spengler prophesied that the West has started its decline. But such a program requires indeed, first, enormous state investment into education in every respect: science, history, anthropology, economics. But there cannot be decent economic research without knowledge of philosophy, history, anthropology, and philosophy, and their likes. Thereby, it requires the end of privatization in many areas. Privatization of public utilities and education has been many times a disaster. As for economics, and as I told you, I agree with Robert Skidelsky in his last book, the Department of Economics are now an infamy. students are not taught economics, but a caricature of old ideas, general equilibrium theory and their likes. Everybody knows that it is completely useless, but as Thomas Ferguson told me, the existence condition of economic departments is to create a generation of robots deprived of any culture and future slaves of the financial markets and the ruling interest. It doesn't mean that I reject modelization or mathematics, but what I reject is economics taught by failed mathematicians or third-rate mathematicians. If they are that interested by mathematics, they should go to the Department of Mathematics. But what about the so-called financial industry? As it is completely useless. It only exists to create wealth out of nothing. It is truly a creation of debt or money ex nihilo. What is the use of the derivatives and the derivatives of derivatives? Absolutely nothing. So, no progress could exist as long as either the system collapses or is not bailed out, or change his mind, and that instead of the Tommy Geithner, we have a new John Pierpont Morgan. So, banks should be indeed under strict control by the central bank. Which would require that we have central bankers understanding what is at stake, and not former technocrats, like the former chair of the UCB, a former head of the Treasury during the Mitterrand administration, saved from jail by the will of the president, and the new one, Draghi, who was the creator of the financial markets. So banks should only be allowed to create money with a direct counterpart, a creation of productive expenditures and real assets. And now, without such a control, which requires indeed a strong policy will, not only banks are creating money for speculation, but there is worse. Banks are creating money for themselves through a complex network. I am the chief of a large bank in France and Germany. And I create a lot of branches or disguised branches. And I grant them credits. But since they are some kind of part of the bank, they buy with the money, they buy stocks issued by the banks. So banks create now their own capital. It is why those who say that banks need capital is absurd, completely absurd. It could have been true a very long time ago. It is not true anymore. This could be undertaken. But what about now globalization and inequality? First, people should read again Rosa Luxemburg and even Karl Marx. Capitalism was born global and was always global, as far as I know. So, nothing is new. The problem is that globalization for Rosa Luxemburg, who is a martyr of both good economics and socialism, and even for Lenin, excuse me to quote Lenin, imperialism and globalization were required because of over-accumulation relative to the lack of demand in domestic economy. All this being connected with accumulation of price value, I don't emphasize. But now, globalization cannot anymore explain in the terms of Rosa Luxemburg, because obviously there is not over-accumulation in France or Germany. Private investment operated in Germany, in France, by German and French. By the way, there is not the least integration and about never integration between European capitalism. Investment is quasi zero. And the collapse of net investment added to austerity leads indeed to a decline of aggregate demand and thereby your profits. So what happens? Money, euros or dollars. With this money, they build plants in Eastern Europe. They are less and less reluctant to invest in China because there is still a state in China. In the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, there is no more state. Real wages in Eastern Europe are lower than in some part of China because industrial structure was completely wiped out by the so-called liberalization policy. So, labor costs are extremely low. After, of course, they don't sell their output in the Czech Republic and Slovakia or Romania, excepting the local drug lords or politicians, there is no demand. So they re-export their production to Western Europe or to the US, which means that statistics are less and less reliable. But since production costs are quasi zero, selling price didn't drop much, so you imagine the gigantic profits resulting from globalization. And you could say this is connected with the problem of Greece. Greece industrial structure had been wiped out by the creation of the euro. Because of the civil war from 1944 to 1948, the government was obliged to raise expenditures. They couldn't rely on the army after the coup d'etat. But there was indeed deficit, because on whom taxes could have been raised. Since the Orthodox Church doesn't pay tax, thereby, thanks to the Greek deficits, were for a time, because there were strong unions, there was still income. The Germans produce in the Czech Republic or Slovakia, and after they sold their output to the Greeks, thanks to income generated by the deficit. It was another source of gigantic profits for German firms. So, when the Greek government had to issue debt bought by German and French banks, it was subsidizing German capitalism. So this system is obviously self-destroying because soon there will be no more income in the Eurozone. There remains the US. But the US do not run high enough a deficit in terms of balance, of trade balance to absorb the output from globalization. So what should be done? I proposed that there should be a special tax raised on profits generated by this complex system of globalization, which could suppress the incentive of investing abroad instead of the domestic country. For a while, it could be useful taxes. But all this require indeed some kind of cultural revolution, that people understood that the hawks of the ruling elite, that the Eurozone is the new Iron Hill, to quote the well-known book by Jack London, 1911. In this book, which Trotsky deemed the first novel consistent with revolution and Marxism, London imagined a future in which the whole humankind is enslaved to an elite of finance people with mercenaries to maintain public order. And now the mercenaries are the technocrats or official economists. But in Brussels, there are debates on the creation of private armies, mercenaries recruited in Eastern Europe, in France, taking care of the lack of police. The government secretly imported police from Romania and Bulgaria. So we need a political culture. We need indeed a political mobilization of intellectuals, lay people, students, whatever. We need a new kind of leaders. We need a new Franklin Roosevelt and not incompetent leaders like Angela Merkel, François Hollande, or poor Barack Obama. So this is the sole way to leave the road to serfdom and to enter the road to a bright future. Thank you.
Okay. Bien, vamos a hacer preguntas, unas 2, 3 preguntas para que el profesor nos conteste y dar fin a este seminario. ¿Quién quisiera participar? Claudia.
Sí, no.
Vamos a buscar el
Dr. Parguez, you mentioned that now banks are creating money for themselves.
Yes.
But first, how is this process? And the second one is how this process affects the whole circuit. Sorry, but this is...
Well, it is not recorded at all because we don't have any more reliable data on money creation. I try to explore the balance sheet of the French largest bank, the Crédit Lyonnais. I renounced because it would require the full team. We know that it exists, and the first question, the mechanism, is extremely complex. And I must say that financial engineers are very shrewd. First, you have the bank. And the banks create a lot of quasi-autonomous branches or departments. For instance, agency located into supermarkets who grant loans at 20% interest rates. Some of them are located abroad. those banks, those local branches buy assets because they need a balance sheet. But they borrow money to the initial bank, and it is created, it is computed as loan to an independent financial agency. But what do this agency do with the money? It buys stocks of the bank. So it creates the capital of the bank. So finally, banks are creating money for themselves. Obviously, such an absurd policy which is violating any stability rule is tremendously increasing. And those agencies, those dependent or pseudo de facto dependent institution could be located elsewhere than in the initial domestic country. So the system generates the fact that capital controls are completely inefficient. And that the system finally no more needs the real economy. Obviously, sooner or later, it should collapse. And it only survives because governments and central banks do nothing to prevent it. But this is not the end of the story. Since banks create their capital, capital requires the payments of dividends. And now you enter an amazing system. Dividends are reinvested in stocks, so net worth of bank is increasing and the system becomes rooted in nothingness, which is completely outside the understanding of the average economic professor, of president of banks, who covers, they are very happy with their enormous income. But the system is going mad, you see, and this is a proof that capitalism has lost any decency or social utility. What will be the final outcome I hope it could be a new system, more social, more efficient, with more true growth, or it could be a more catastrophic system. As Trotsky said, from a catastrophe, the worst of the good could emerge. I hope. I am still optimistic that it could be the good. But when you think that in French and German university curriculum, no more courses on money and monetary theory. What is taught is just that financial engineering. And it is a recipe, I think, for true disaster. And you ask me the title of the book, The Decline of the